Background to the Constitution. The Constitution of the United States is one of the written instruments that bears heavily upon our life and our times. It is, as we know, the basic instrument of government in this country, and it is one that should take a certain amount of our attention so that we know what it says and what it does not say. There are many misconceptions about the Constitution, but before we consider the instrument itself, perhaps a brief review of the events leading up to its formation and adoption would be in order. Let's go back in time and recall that we were engaged in a war with Great Britain, which war is generally admitted to have begun in 1775 with the battles of Lexington and Concord. It ran through until 1782, when the last battle was fought. In that period of the war, the first thing that happened was that during the process of the war, the various colonies or the colonial governments that had been established by the British Crown were converted into separate states. This occurred all the way through the war, and actually one or two had converted prior to the actual opening of hostilities. That is to say, the local colonists drove out the British governor and simply picked up the reins of government as they had been established originally by Britain and converted the state or the colony into a state by setting up representative houses such as the House of Burgesses in Virginia and so on. And thus, throughout the war period, 13 separate states were ultimately organized. At the time the war began, that was not the case, but by the time it ended, that had become the case. In fact, the states had all come into existence by 1781, at which time the Articles of Confederation were put together with the idea of binding the states into something of a union so that they would stay together for the duration of the war. It is instructive, I think, to note that under the Articles of Confederation, which were set up as a permanent union, and from which it was presumed no one could ever secede, and this is the Articles I'm speaking of, in fact, it was to have permanent existence, and the fact that it doesn't exist now indicates how impermanent some things that are intended to be permanent are. In this instrument, there was no power to tax, no power to conscript. It was simply it had the effect of a treaty binding together the 13 separate states. Now, that was drawn up in 1781. In 1782, we had the final battle of the war, the Battle of Yorktown, and then the war ended, but it took us a year to say so officially, because we had no central government. True, we had the 13 separate states, and the 13 separate states tried to arrange for some kind of a treaty, but Great Britain recognized that she had not been engaged in a war with states. She had been engaged with the entire colonial area, and hence, in order to obtain a treaty, what finally occurred was that the French, who were the Americans' primary and really only ally, put their bid in, and the result was that the delegates to create the treaty had to travel to Paris, and the treaty that ensued, that brought American independence, is the Treaty of Paris. Now, that finally came into existence in 1783. We still had no central government. During the war, we had come up with an instrument, the Declaration of Independence, which had been drafted by 56 men in Philadelphia in 1776. The Declaration of Independence had no legal standing at all. It says on the head of the instrument, that is the Declaration, it says in Congress, and it is generally stated in the history books, that this was an enactment by the Second Continental Congress, as though there was, in fact, then in existence, a general legal body. But this is not true. The word Congress was being used as a synonym for convention, and what it was the Second Continental Convention that had met in Philadelphia on July 1st of 1776 that provided the Declaration of Independence. But the Declaration had no legal standing. It was not a government instrument. It had simply been put together by 56 volunteers, and now the war was over, and we had a treaty, and we were, by this treaty, officially separated from Great Britain. Nothing happened in the way of a general movement toward a central political government in the next 2 years. That is, from 1783 to 1785, nothing ensued. We operated under the separate governments, the separate states, and everyone seemed to be content. But by 1785, a movement began to get underway calling for the creation of an amendment to the Articles of Confederation so that it would continue with a little more force and power than it had. Actually, there was little power in it. And now there were those who began to champion the idea that the Articles ought to be revised so that it would become more than a de facto treaty binding the colonies together, or rather the states, but it would become an instrument of government per se. There was not very much enthusiasm for this. The prime movers for this type of thing were in Pennsylvania and New York, but many of the colonies were indifferent to this idea, and the population at large in general took the view that they had just gotten rid of their government and they really didn't need another one. They weren't thinking of the states as being governments so much as they were thinking of them as being representative bodies, more or less like politically endowed chambers of commerce that would take care of the public sector in their various areas, but would not be a restrictive or binding type of thing. However, the movement from 1785 to 1787, leading toward a central government, began to gain strength. And by 1787, the various legislatures in the separate states decided that at least the matter could be considered. The consequence was that delegates were appointed from each of the 13 states who were charged with the responsibility of going to Philadelphia for a convention, there to study the Articles of Confederation, to see whether or not the Articles could be strengthened without interfering with the sovereignty of the separate states. And then, having worked on that instrument as a study group, the various delegates were charged with the responsibility of returning to the legislatures that had sent them and reporting back in. Then the legislatures were to take whatever action they wished, whether they would accept or reject the findings of the group in Philadelphia. It becomes a matter, I suppose, of some consternation to Americans who have not necessarily studied their own history in depth when I tell them that it is a melancholy fact of history that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 have not reported back yet. They never did return, and as a matter of fact, they never did consider the Articles of Confederation, which was the only thing they were authorized to consider. As a matter of fact, and a little footnote to American history, some of the delegates, when they arrived at Philadelphia, were completely nonplussed to discover that the convention was already in the hands of a group of people calling themselves Federalists or Constitutionalists, and these people had already decided that the Articles of Confederation were not even going to be considered. Instead, they had already prepared the rough draft of what was to be an entirely new government. This was not what they had been authorized to consider, and the consequence is that a number of the delegates, finding that they could not even consider the instrument that they had been sent to consider, simply got on their horses and rode away. This included the entire delegation from Rhode Island, a major portion of the delegation from New York, and here and there a few other delegates. So those people never did participate in the Constitutional Convention, and if you examine one of the memorial copies of the Constitution to come from the convention, you will note the fact that no one from Rhode Island was there, and that the delegation from New York is particularly sparse. In any case, the Constitution itself was put together during this convention of 1787. Now, it contains within itself a method of ratification which would make it unnecessary to turn the Constitution over to the people so that the people would examine it and decide voluntarily of their own free act and deed whether or not they wanted to be bound under the instrument. Additionally, it avoids the necessity of going to the state legislatures, which did comprise the then existing government, and if there had been any legality to the process, certainly at least the elected representatives of the people should have been given the opportunity of examining the Constitution. This, too, was bypassed because it was recognized by the Federalists at the Constitutional Convention that the state representatives would never approve of the instrument that they had drafted. And so they devised a different way of getting over this or around this particular obstacle by writing Article 7 to the Constitution, which specifies that the Constitution is to be ratified not by the people at large and not by the elected representatives of the people, but by state conventions that are to be held. And this gave the Federalists an opportunity to have a constitutional convention in the separate states under their own management. Thus it worked out with the passing of time that the various states only convened a convention for purposes of considering the Constitution when the Federalists, who were in charge of the movement, had been fairly certain that they had packed it in favor of the decision that they wanted. Thus, as Forrest MacDonald, who has written a definitive work on the subject entitled We the People, expresses it, the whole affair was a stacked deck, and the Constitution was simply railroaded through without the legislative representatives of the people or the people themselves being called upon to examine it or even to have anything to do with it. One of the interesting things about the Constitution, and it is important that I make this point, is that we have been led to believe in this country that the Constitution is such a magnificent instrument of government that it is virtually on a level with Holy Writ. It is, according to some people who have praised it out of hand, an instrument or the best instrument ever struck off by the hand of man at a given instant in time. And this kind of praise has tended to wrap the Constitution in an impenetrable wall of sanctity, which more or less shunts away the inquiring mind. We simply take the Constitution as being what the publicity concerning it said that it was, and very few of us take the time to examine it, and to examine it in a penetrating way so we can find out what it says. There are, in fact, a number of illusions that we have concerning the instrument. For example, I was told when I was in school that it was an instrument of limited powers. Now, that's an interesting phrase, and we should examine it to see whether or not that is true. Also, we have been told repeatedly that it is an instrument of checks and balances, and there is an assumption, I think, in the minds of most people, that it is an instrument that protects their rights, that sets forth the proposition that they are innocent unless proven guilty, and that it specifies somehow that they have a right to own private property. No such provisions exist in the Constitution. There is nothing in it that says that your rights are protected. There is nothing that suggests that you are innocent until proven guilty, and there is nothing in it that says that you have the right to own property. As a matter of fact, the word right does not even appear in the body of the Constitution, but the word power appears either directly or by literary inference 47 times. It is clearly an instrument that was drawn up for the purpose of creating a consolidation of power. That's what it was intended to be, and that is, in fact, what it is. I don't know whether your experience has been the same as mine, but when I was in the 4th grade in school, I was told that I had to read the Constitution, and I did so, being very obedient at the time. I not only read it, but I was called upon to memorize the preamble, and I did. And the interesting thing is that from that time on, if anybody asked me, even after I had reached adulthood, had I ever read the Constitution, I responded truthfully that I had indeed read it. And I would submit for your consideration that a child in the 4th grade, who may very well have read the Constitution because it was demanded of him, doesn't know what those words mean. And I certainly didn't know what they meant, and I had never gone back to read it. As a matter of fact, I would suppose that this is the fate of many Americans who state repeatedly how great the instrument is, but in point of fact, as adults, they have never examined it. They don't know what it says. They only know what has been said about it by others, and I would suggest that a good way to remedy that defect would be to take a good look at the instrument itself. It is not a suppressed document. You can readily obtain a copy, and I would suggest that the instrument itself is its own best evidence. The thing that caused me to first take a look at the Constitution with something in the nature of an arched eyebrow was the discovery that the names that appeared on the bottom of the Constitution were unfamiliar to me. Now, I have been something of a buff relating the early American history. I'm very fond of reading about the marvelous exploits of the American patriots who broke with England and declared for human rights and for human liberty and ultimately won the victory. That has a kind of a deeply emotional and a deeply satisfying relationship to me and to my background. And so I had, at an early time, familiarized myself with many of the names that appear on the Declaration of Independence. And casually one day, as I was examining the Constitution, and I had one of these very fine memorial copies that has the names of people at the bottom of it, I got to looking at it more closely, and the names of the persons there listed and attested to by the Secretary of the Convention as having participated in the Convention, these were names that were largely unfamiliar to me. I had never heard of them before, and being familiar with the other names at the bottom of the Declaration, I was a little bit nonplussed. So I went back over it to find out where I had made the error, and I discovered that the only 6 names appear on both the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And that's a very interesting thing, because, you see, when I was in school, I had been told that we had a group of men in this country who were called the Founding Fathers, and I had usually thought of them in connection with the Declaration of Independence. I had simply assumed that these same men would have their names attached to the Constitution, but I didn't find them, excepting in 6 cases. So then I made a comparison to find out what the facts were, and finding only 6 that repeated, I had to check into it still further to what happened to the other 50 whose names do appear on the Declaration but do not appear on the Constitution. Well, 3 of them were dead, and obviously they had no choice in the matter, and another 12 had been banished from the country or had left it one way or another during the Revolution. And so that accounts for 15, and 6 are accounted for by virtue of the fact that their names do appear. That leaves 35 of the original signers of the Declaration who could have participated in the Constitution, but who did not. And I was reluctantly led to the conclusion that in this country we had a case of double paternity. We had 2 sets of Founding Fathers, one group that brought about the separation from England, and who indeed were the people who came up with the concept of rights, and then almost entirely another group of men who gave us the Constitution, with, as I pointed out, 6 exceptions. Well, I went over the names of the people that were the most meaningful to me as Founding Fathers. Who were they? Well, the people like John Hancock, Samuel Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Mason, Patrick Henry, people like that. Those names have, I suppose, a familiar ring to you and to me. What were those men doing? Those names, none of those appear on the Constitution. What were they doing when the Constitutional Convention was going on? Well, they weren't delegates to it. Well, what were they doing at the time the Constitution was to be ratified in the separate state conventions? Well, they were doing all they could to keep it from being ratified. In other words, the very people who had given us the Declaration of Independence were almost up in arms in opposition to the Constitution. And this is a point that is usually overlooked in your histories. When you read about it, you get the impression that there is just one group of people, and they put through the Declaration, and they put through the Constitution, and here we have just this same wonderful thing going right straight through, and indeed we do not. One group gave us the Declaration, and almost an entirely different body gave us the Constitution. Well, I began to cast about to find out what the opinions of these people were that caused them to be either inactive insofar as the Constitution was concerned, or actually opposed. And I began to run across statements made by a number of people who had examined the Constitution and had not praised it out of hand. I'm thinking, for instance, of Lord Macaulay, one of Britain's great historians, who, in the midst of the 19th century, was sent a copy of the Constitution, and it was expected by the party who sent it to him that he would respond in a real flowery bit of praise of this magnificent piece of legal legerdemain. And instead, Macaulay responded, "I confess, sir, to be unimpressed with your Constitution. It is all sail and no anchor." Now that is something of a forbidding conclusion. So I did a little examination of Alexis de Tocqueville's great work, Democracy in America, a 2-volume study which I believe has no parallel. It's one of the great studies in political science extant today and still hailed by many people as one of the finest works written in this field. De Tocqueville came to America in the 1840s very, very much enthused about the general idea of democracy. He had been very much opposed to the unbridled license and power of kings, and it seemed to him that the idea that men should elect their own governors and that the government should be representative of their wishes was a magnificent breakthrough that was going to lead into all kinds of good things for people. And after arriving on these shores, de Tocqueville did express himself very favorably in respect to the people that he saw and what they were doing. He found it much superior to what he was familiar with in France and in the rest of Europe. But then someone handed him a copy of the Constitution. And after looking at it, he said, "I will give the people under this instrument 200 years from the date of its ratification until they descend under a complete despotism." Now there is a very foreboding prophecy, and made by a man who was not really a mental midget, a man who is obviously well informed and who said what he did with real thought behind it. Then he went on in his work, Democracy in America, to describe what he now detected as the great weaknesses of democracy, which he thought would lead into a kind of tyranny that was new, but nonetheless a kind of tyranny. So that was the reaction of de Tocqueville. I was particularly interested in the comments of Benjamin Franklin. Franklin is one of the names that appears on both instruments. He signed the Declaration of Independence, and he also was counted as being present at the Constitutional Convention. Curiously, what had happened was this. It's a real cute little thing. Jefferson's opposition to the Constitution, or to the whole idea of any Constitution, was so well known and so deep that the Federalists despaired of even having a Constitutional Convention as long as Jefferson was in the United States. And so they contrived to get him sent to France as our ambassador to France before they would schedule the meeting in Philadelphia. And this they did. But in so doing, they didn't relieve Franklin, who was at that time our ambassador to France. And so Thomas Jefferson walked into his ambassadorial offices anticipating that Franklin would have long since left, and Franklin wasn't even aware that he had been deposed. But Franklin, being a very wise and, of course, by this time a very old man, took the matter in stride and simply said, "Well, Tom, someone has made a mistake, but let you and I say nothing about it." Besides, Franklin admitted that what he wanted to do was to get back to America, and he had become a very old man, and this was actually a godsend to him because he wanted to get back to Philadelphia to see how things were there. That was his home, and this gave him the opportunity. So nothing was said, and he simply packed up and returned to America. When he got to Philadelphia, the convention was already in progress. So he went down to see what was going on. The meeting was being chaired by George Washington, but the moment Franklin came through the door into the assembly, the meeting stopped. Everyone stood up and gave him a standing ovation because, as you well know, Franklin was sort of the senior citizen of America and the savant, the wise man of the period. Washington offered Franklin the opportunity of chairing the meeting, and Franklin accepted it as an honor, and then asked for a copy of the Constitution, which he read. Having read the Constitution, he then interrupted the proceedings and announced to the delegates that he would recommend 3 changes. He said that there was a place in 3 places in the Constitution where unbridled power had been granted, and these places were 1 in the executive branch, 2 in the legislative branch, and 3 in the judicial branch. But he lost on all counts. Every suggestion that he made was simply swept aside, and they went ahead and approved the Constitution as it had existed. His own foreboding at the end of the meeting was prophetic. He said at the end, "Well, gentlemen, you have a Constitution. It is not as good as we could have hoped, but it is good as we are going to get, and it will serve us all right for a while. But it will end in tyranny, because there is nothing within it to prevent it." Thank you.